I'm going to title this Jonah as parody of Israel. And if you wanted a different title, I would offer you this one, Jonah as parable about Israel. You can take your pick. You know, like Jesus's parables were stories about Israel. And immediately we are confronted with something that people often do not realize. Let me illustrate. Let's use Jesus' example for a minute before we come back to Jonah, okay? If you look at Jesus' parables, fictional stories about individuals, they understood at the time that ultimately those stories were not about individuals. Ultimately, those stories were about Israel. So, for instance, if you look at the parable of the Good Samaritan in Luke 10, that's not a story about this good person who happened to do this and some bad people who happen to be religious and do what they weren't supposed to do. Well, inside the story, that's what it is. But it really refers to a reality that's much greater than that, and that is the reality of Israel. Now, our problem today is that we don't understand that because we are individualists. And we won't go into why that is. It has a lot to do with the Enlightenment and, you know, with basically what happened in Europe a couple hundred years ago, in the 1700s and so on. We are individualists, so we go to these stories and we think they are about this individual. We go to, for instance, the parable of the prodigal son in Luke 15, and there are many Christians who automatically think this must be about personal evangelism. Nobody at the time would have thought that. If you look at the Bible, personal evangelism is almost not existent. I mean, there's a tiny little bit here and there, but it's always under a much bigger story, which is how is God's people doing? So the parable of the prodigal son, and yes, I'll come to Jonah shortly, but I just want to set this context, okay? The parable of the prodigal son is not about Johnny down the road who had a rough life and made some bad decisions, and then he came home and he found God, and now Johnny's in a better place and he joins a local church and all that. No, that's too small. That's our individualism that makes us go there. No, the parable of the prodigal son is absolutely about different ways of being Israel or different ways of being God's people as represented by the two brothers. All right. I'm a hermeneutics geek. I don't know how many of you have come across this term, hermeneutics. It's basically how interpretation works. And as such, I'm far more interested in how a text was doing things for them at the time rather than what it is doing for us now. What I mean by that is this. If we immediately think that because of our respect for biblical texts, we can somehow magically make them apply to us, and I assure you, there are seminaries up and down the land. There are hundreds of books, thousands actually, written by theology professors up and down the land that treat the text exactly like that. But if we do that, we have just ripped it away from the people for whom it was actually written. I'm a hermeneutics geek. I'm interested in treating the text well. People sometimes come to me and they say, I need to know what is your view of the Bible? What view do you have of it in terms of being God's word, in terms of it being inspired or whatever adjectives people bring up? What they don't understand is if they want to learn something, if I want to learn something, the more important thing to learn, the thing that comes prior anyway, is how to interpret well. I mean, what good is it if we hold the Bible in high esteem, and then we slaughter it. And we take out a verse here and a verse there. We even put it on some liturgical calendar, maybe. We have really complex Bible reading plans that completely rearrange things. Well, why are we reading it at all then? We wouldn't do that with Shakespeare, would we? We wouldn't do it with a Star Tribune either. But somehow with the Bible, apparently it's okay to take a little here and a little there and turn those little bits, not just rip them out of context, but turn them into effectively Christianized fortune cookies. That's not what I'm after. All right, so my point to you today is, let's talk about Jonah. That Jonah is fun. And I'm not saying this because it's cool to say, hey, the Bible has some fun stuff in it. I don't care. That's not my point. My point is that if we interpret Jonah as Jonah was expected to be interpreted at the time, we come to the conclusion that it is comedic. Now, people typically don't understand that about Jonah. And why is that? And again, we could talk about the Enlightenment and a lot of things that happened in my homeland. I'm German, and things that got exported to this country. And we could talk about all kinds of things, but ultimately it boils down to this. We have been led to ask the wrong questions. One favorite wrong question when it comes to the book of Jonah is that people immediately ask, did this happen? That's not how you interpret a story. I mean, let's say you go to any fictional story, a fictional story where it's evident, it's not even debatable, it is fictional if any such stories. I'm not thinking Jonah right now, but just generally. Would you then go and ask, did this really happen? That'd be silly. Why do we do that with Jonah? And then you have this thing where you have liberals and you have conservatives, and the liberals say, nah, it didn't happen. They probably believed it at the time. They took legends and they were so primitive, they thought it happened. And then the conservative or evangelical or charismatic or whatever answer comes, no, no, no. This is God's word. Of course, they thought it happened, as if those things had anything to do with each other, which they do not. One is a judgment of whether something has divine authority, and the other is a judgment about how it should be interpreted. And I don't think we should go in that direction at all. We should treat Jonah like we would treat any other literature and interpret it well. There's this thing in theology where professors will tell students, especially in seminaries, that there is a special hermeneutic, a special way of interpreting the Bible. You know, at that point, I just lost interest. The whole point of these texts is not to be special, where you need some mysterious key that someone in the institution holds, probably. The whole point is the opposite. This is for normal people at the time. We just need to make the effort like we would with Shakespeare and the Star Tribune. We would read it as if it were written as it was for those people. And if you go to France on vacation and you read, I don't know, Le Soir or something, some newspaper, you're going to read it as if it had been written for people in Paris and not you. So why are we not doing that with Jonah? Here's another one, another wrong question. People reduce everything to topics. That's such a sort of a scourge in theology. You think if you got the topic right, you've interpreted it. No, you have not. People say things like, Jonah is about the topic of universalism, not universalism in the sense of everyone is safe necessarily, but universalism in the basic sense of God is interested in everyone. Well, I hope that is true. I think that is true. But that's hardly an interpretive question. So in the case of Jonah, scholars, often say Jonah challenged a particular notion that we call particularism. It's a form of exceptionalism, basically, right? In this country, there's talk of American exceptionalism in some some quarters. And some have said, well, Israel had a similar thing, which is true. And we still see this today, that many people here think that their notions of exceptionalism now are somehow based on exceptionalism to do with Israel. Well, that's not an interpretive question. We can have different opinions on that. Some make more sense than others, but none of that is interpretive. Do you see what I'm doing here? I'm basically saying, if we want to honor the text, not just say that we do, but actually do it, we need to ask the right questions. Here's another wrong question, and I'm going to move on to some better stuff in a minute, but another wrong question is that how should we label Jonah? Well, I already told you how I label it, and I gave you a pick. Label it a parody or label it a parable. The choice is yours. And my point here is this, though. People, and I blame our educational system for that. And actually, I graduated from high school in this country and in Germany. Germany didn't give me credit. They made me do another 3 years, then I graduated again. So that was a bit of a downer way back. But one thing that is clear to me is that when people go through their normal educational system here, they are told that certain things are very important, including definitions. Teachers test that stuff, and labels. Well, this shirt probably has a label back there. I don't care about the label. I care about the shirt. Definitions are that label. We need the shirt. And so, again, in the case of Jonah, we need to ask not even primarily, is it satire? Is it parody? Is it irony? But if you must know, it's all of the above. And I'll come back to that point later. We should interpret first before we classify stuff. All right, another wrong question. How does this story compare with Greek tragedy? It's an intelligent question. It's just not interpretive. Yes, the Greeks had tragedies that they developed and enjoyed and performed and so on, and fascinating stuff. Sometimes they would have actors performing something, and right before the end, everyone walks off the stage, and nobody threw tomatoes at them. Everybody knew that it was part of the performance, that now the audience had to, in their minds, on the way home, communally, they would finish the story, and so on. I think this is fascinating. Now we can ask, did the Jews, the Hebrews, did they have something like that? It's an intelligent question, but it doesn't help us interpret the text. So we're going to leave that one. Here's another one. I have two more wrong questions, and then we're done with that part, okay? So one is, what were possible sources of the book of Jonah? As a scholar, I have to say, I don't care. Well, I would care if A, we could be reasonably certain in our judgment about that, and B, it would actually help us with interpretation. In that case, I would care. But just to ask the questions, just so it's asked, because we as scholars ask them and we write books, and every Bible commentary and every study Bible has introductions at the front of each book, and they answer all these wrong questions, and some of them answer them well, and some of them fail. But ultimately, those questions don't actually help with interpretation. I mean, you could do that exercise. Go to a study Bible. Even the better ones, there are a lot of awful ones, but you read those introductory portions for something like Mark's Gospel. I've done this with students. I've given it to them and said, all right, we have 6 pages of introduction here. Find me anything in here that actually helps with interpretation. So we're not going there. But Jonah probably, Jonah shows evidence of some other literature in the Hebrew scriptures, and we're not going to pursue that because it's not interpretive. All right. And finally, if you want to know, by the way, Deuteronomy, Exodus, Jeremiah, and Joel are the one. Well, we could throw the Psalms in there too, because Jonah had that. He did that Psalm type thing, and there's some echoes there too. Those are the sources that seem to have left a mark in Jonah, but that's not interpretation. Let's move on. Final wrong question. How did Jonah's proclamation to the Ninevites, when he finally did it, how did that affect history? Well, ironically, when he finally succeeded, and they repented. And leaving aside the question of fictional or not, okay, I'll get back to that. But for now, we'll leave it aside. Irrespective of him succeeding, the reality is that in empirical history, the Assyrians, Nineveh, Assyria, they gave subsequently Israel an extremely hard time and all but destroyed Israel. So that would be the supreme irony, wouldn't it? That Jonah finally does as he's told, and if he hadn't, then Israel would have been in a better place later. That's interesting, but that is not interpretation. All right, I'm done. I'm done with that part. I'm done with what I call the wrong questions. So I told you that I think it's all of the above in the sense of parody, satire, irony. Lots of ironies in there. I'll give them to you a little bit later. Now, one question when we look at things like satire and parody, one thing we have to ask at that point is, what is the target? For those of you who still want to focus on definitions because you're not persuaded by me saying that's superficial, we need to do better than that. But if you are interested in definitions, satire typically is seen as having that notion of a target. You know, when Saturday Night Live has a skit and they have a go at Trump, you know it's about Trump, right? So anyway, there's some differences, satire, parody, and so on. But what I want to do instead is simply to ask if satire has a target. Does Jonah have a target? And the answer is, yep, absolutely. Now, most have said, scholars, theologians, pastors, anyone who has anything to say about Jonah, most will say that the target is Jonah. It's the prophet. And they say that because there's a prophet called Jonah mentioned elsewhere in the Hebrew scriptures. But again, that's not an interpretive question for Jonah. So they say Jonah is the target. To me, that makes no sense. I'm telling you this because if it doesn't make sense to say that, then we have to look for another target. And I'm giving you one. But for now, let's stick with this one that I'm denying is that I don't think Jonah is the target. Jonah is doing absurd stuff. He ends up in fantastical situations, grotesque. There are distortions. There's ridiculing. There are ironies. There's parody. Jonah changes. It's like he's a sort of mental shapeshifter kind of guy. Okay, so there is all of that. I don't think any of that is about targeting Jonah. I already told you in the title I gave you, I think it's about targeting Israel. And he's playing that role in this story. So my contention to you is that that is how people would have understood it at a time. But those who say, no, this is about this crazy man, they have to explain some stuff. For instance, in his prayer in the fish, how about that? Speaking of grotesque and fantastical. In his prayer in the fish, in the corner of the stomach of the fish, he shows no contrition, no repentance, nothing. And okay, that could be the point of this book, I guess, that there's a guy who was just unwilling or incapable of showing such things. Fine. Would they have written in that society, in an oral society, in a tribal society like that, an entire book just to make that trivial little point about some crazy person? I don't mean, literally a crazy, whatever that means. I mean, someone who comes across as crazy in the text. Would they have done that? No. I mean, writing was a very big deal. Hardly anyone could do it, and hardly anyone had the materials to do it. So no, there's something bigger going on here. I don't think this is about ridiculing Jonah per se. As a person, I mean, and that's irrespective of whether this is partially historical or partially fictional or all of either of those. So what I want to do now with you is I want to give you some examples from the Hebrew scriptures other than Jonah to show that notions of situational irony and even satire, in the sense of targeting someone outside of the story, someone empirical, someone real, that this was a thing in the Hebrew scriptures. So I'm going to take you briefly, and you don't have to look at it now. I just want you to get the gist of this, and you can look it up later. So 2 Samuel has something called the succession narrative. So, you have Saul, you have David, and so on. And there's definitely satire there in both books of Samuel and both books called Kings, 1st and 2nd Kings. So the succession narrative is about the ascension of David to the throne. This is in 2 Samuel 11. Let me just read something to you. In the spring of that year, the time when kings go to battle, David sent Joab with his officers and all Israel with him. And they went to battle. They ravaged the Ammonites. They besieged Rabbah. But David remained in Jerusalem. Come on, that is funny. The guy is supposed to be the king. That's how he's revered at the time. And he remains in Jerusalem. I mean, he sends everyone out there to do battle. He throws the kitchen sink at the Ammonites. Actually, he doesn't. He gets Joab to do that. And why? Well, he's staying in Jerusalem. So what does he do in Jerusalem? Well, this is really interesting. He, instead of fighting battles, which is why the ancients wanted kings more than anything, he sends Joab out there, and when everyone's gone, he has a look at this beautiful woman, Bathsheba, and he starts an affair with her. Now, that is funny, not funny, if you see what I mean, right? I mean, narratively, that is clearly funny. In terms of a real life situation, there's nothing funny about it. But the text was very clear, even back in 1 Samuel 8:19, I think it is, that the people wanted a king in the first place because, quote, or because that king would, quote, govern us and go out before us and fight our battles. But David sends someone else to do that. Meanwhile, he has eyes for a beautiful woman. And we know how that continued. It's quite astonishing, really. So the writer of Samuel apparently thinks that monarchy is not good for Israel. And it is a pretty good point here. If the best, or one of the best of the kings, is like this, how much worse is kingship going to be under others? That's kind of what's happening here in Samuel. So Samuel deliberately put seemingly contradictory statements side by side in order to draw attention to them. So for instance, when someone is rejected, someone beautiful is rejected for the monarchy, and it is said that beauty doesn't really matter, you need other qualities in your king. And then David is selected to be king. The text says that he was really beautiful, and he had these beautiful eyes. Do you see what I mean? Do you see what I'm doing here? I mean, these guys are the equivalent, to at least to some extent, of the ancient equivalent to sketch writers for SNL. There is that. There's a whole lot more in the Bible. Don't get me wrong. But I'll just give you another example here. Samuel disliked the idea of a king, apparently, very much. And God says to Samuel, this is in 1 Samuel 8, says that when Samuel disliked the idea and prayed about it, this is always funny. When people pray about stuff they don't like, that means they're not really praying. They're just processing the fact that they don't like something. So Samuel dislikes what the Lord tells him about installing a king. He dislikes it and he prays about it. And this is mentioned a few times. It's really comedic. And God says, hey, listen to the voice of the people in all that they say to you. This is verse 7. And in fact, he says it again, listen to their voice. In verse 9, Samuel doesn't listen to their voice. He prays instead. So Samuel returned to the elders and he tried to talk them out of the idea. And he gave a long speech about all the bad things the king would do. This is verses 11 through 18. We're in 1 Samuel 8 briefly. But the people insisted on having a king. And God insisted on him taking that seriously, that wish by the people and by God. But when the Lord once again says, listen to their voice, I think it's the third time the Lord says that to him in 22, Samuel just doesn't do it. And he basically tells the elders to go home. So my point is, Jonah does something very similar to what Samuel is doing here. And actually, early on in that Samuel story, we find that when he became old, we're told in the text, he made his sons judges over Israel. So all this shenanigans about we don't want a king, we don't need a king, which clearly the people did want a king, even God wanted a king. All that shenanigans was clearly just smoke and mirrors. All this insistence that God is going to be our king. Well, then, Samuel, why then are you ignoring God? All of that suddenly goes up like a puff of smoke when we realize that, in fact, he had no problem appointing his sons. He had no problem with hereditary single leadership as long as it was his own dynasty. So all this talk about we don't need a king, we don't need that single leader, we don't need judges because God is our king, nonsense. And then we have the same thing, by the way, a bit later, we have it with Gideon, and I'll give you that as the last example, and then we'll come straight back to Jonah. So we have Gideon. This is Judges 8, another chapter 8. So in Judges 8:22, when Israel, when Gideon saved Israel by defeating their enemies, and then the people say, of course they do, because this is the number one criterion for a leader: rule over us, you and your son and your grandson. So they want the dynasty, right? The dynasty that apparently Samuel also wanted, but he just didn't let on about it because he was asked to put someone else in charge and he didn't want that. So Gideon's reply is almost theologically identical to Samuel. He says, hey, I will not rule over you. You're asking me to rule over you because of my military prowess. I will not rule over you. My son will not rule over you. The Lord will rule over you. I'm smiling because today we might say he's so full of it when he says that. For starters, he had no problem asking the people to pay him a gold earring each, a tax for the single leader. Apparently, there's some golden things around for purchase these days. I digress. I should stay in that time. Anyway, maybe you know what I'm referring to. So then Gideon he uses the golden earrings and he makes an ephod, which is probably some kind of garment that designates high office. He does everything he said he's not in favor of. And Gideon has a son, and guess what he names the son? He names his son Abimelech, which means my father is king. Do you see the irony? Do you see how comedic this is? And then, of course, after the death of Gideon, Abimelech establishes himself as that king. They had founded a dynasty against everything they said they disliked. They just did it. Neither Samuel nor Gideon were opposed to hereditary rulership, only opposed to it if it meant not them, but someone else. All right, Jonah. Let's go into Jonah. We've had some context here, right? I started off with some scholarly context, wrong questions type thing. Now we looked at Samuel and Judges. Let's go into Jonah. My question is simply this: what are the ironies? What am I talking about in Jonah? Well, it starts off right away. God calls Nineveh a great city. Right, a city of the enemy. What a great city. And then after being given a task, I'm talking about Jonah now, the prophet in the story, the task being to cry out against the great city, he flees and attempts to escape from the presence of the Lord. Joppa, Tarshish, boats, away from the presence of the Lord. Now, everyone who reads this, everyone who hears this at the time, people would have heard this, and later in Greco-Roman times, they would have seen it performed probably. But everyone who hears this knows full well, Jonah, it doesn't matter how many boats you take. It doesn't matter how you pay for it. It doesn't matter how fast you run. It doesn't matter if you're in Joppa or Tarshish, you're still in the presence of the Lord. Okay? Ironies. And then I'm fast forwarding a little. In the midst of ravaging seas, Jonah is sound asleep. Jesus, by the way, this is kind of interesting, but it's for another day. But Jesus emulates some things that Jonah does, that he does comically and with terribly wrong motivation. Jesus actually has his own kind of fun at the expense of Jonah. In situations like, remember when he sleeps at the bottom of the boat in ravaging seas and so on. Okay, but let's not go there now. Super interesting now, but let's stay with this. So in the midst of these ravaging seas, everyone is in turmoil and people are afraid the boat's going to break apart and all the rest of it. He's sound asleep. For real? No, not for real, but in this story. And that's the point. By the way, people often tell me that they have a problem with accepting that the Bible would have fictional stories. Well, the issue with having that view is that you then have to dismiss most of Jesus's teaching, which comes in the shape of fictions. We call them parables, and people knew that. But I digress. So in the midst of this, he's down there asleep. So they confront him. The captain asks him, and first they cast lots. Casting lots is not a good thing. Even the disciples, when Judas had a bit of an issue and now they were down to 11 and they said, ooh, we want to rule the tribes of Israel. We need 12. Let's cast lots and instate someone else. That's a very bad move there in Acts 1. I think Acts 1 just gets terribly slaughtered because people don't understand the things that we're talking about here in terms of how these stories work. But whatever. When people cast lots in the Bible, it's usually not a good thing. So they cast lots. It falls on Jonah. He's the problem. The captain asks him, who are you? And Jonah says, remember, I'm putting ironies in front of you here from the book. Jonah says, with everything he's done, fleeing from the Lord and whatnot, he says, I am a Hebrew, and I worship the Lord and God of heaven. Remember when I used the phrase, full of it? Jonah is full of it at this point. Am I putting myself above some historical character in the past? Of course not. I'm just saying this is the character in this story. It's like you turn the TV on or something, and you have to use your imagination to get into the mind of the characters. Otherwise, what will be the point, right? It's a fundamentally human thing to do, and thank God we have that capacity. That's all I'm doing here. Is I'm just saying if we get into the minds of the characters here, we have to say that this character is full of it. And the irony is that the others, the sailors, actually end up doing what Jonah falsely claims for himself, which is to worship God. They end up doing it. More than that, they end up sacrificing, and they're saying that they have to sacrifice Jonah. What an irony is that? the non-Jews are sacrificing to the God of Israel, and they are sacrificing Jonah because Jonah isn't doing what he's supposed to do. It doesn't get much better than that. But like Abraham, who was asked to sacrifice more explicitly than here, the sailors, they just put two and two together. Abraham was prepared to do it. You know the episode, right? So a large fish comes along and swallows Jonah, and Jonah is now hopefully comfortable enough in the corner of the stomach of the fish to write poetry. I hope he had a little desk there. It's incredible. This story is so much fun. So he constructs what can only be called a psalm, the Psalm of Jonah. And what's his case in that psalm? If you read that, he says, Lord, thank you for rescuing me. Wait, from what? Because being digested in the stomach is better than just drowning out in the water? Is that it? I hope you don't think I'm making fun of it. I'm not making fun of anything. I'm just seeing fun that's staring us in the face. Jonah says, I cried to the Lord. I looked to the temple. What? You escaped. You fled from the Lord. Get my verbs right here. Tenses. You went to Tarshish. And now you're saying this in prayer? Are you kidding? I was driven away from you. No, you ran away. They worship vain idols. No, Jonah. That's what you're doing. And that idol is called selfishness. And it's the selfishness, by the way, that Israel is living. That's how Jonah plays Israel's role. When Israel says, oh, about that Abrahamic covenant thing back in Genesis 12, that we're supposed to somehow benefit the world. Let's not do that. I will sacrifice to the Lord, Jonah says. Well, you have just been sacrificed to the Lord by the sailors because of your, how can I put it, your utter lack of willingness to do what God actually wants of you and what God actually wants of Israel in this world. And notice there's zero contrition in Jonah's psalm. He, in many ways, is implicitly putting God at fault in all this. And yeah, it's everyone's fault. It's the Ninevites' fault. It's God's fault. It's not Jonah's fault. Read that psalm. Is there any sense of, yeah, I can see that? Nah, it's not what he's doing. That would actually destroy the narrative structure of this text if there were, but there is not. All right, so Jonah's prayer is almost entirely a mix of falsity, apportioning blame, entitlement, and whitewashing. I want to say, just as an aside, there are psalms, including psalms ascribed to David, where it is impressive that characters are, like Psalm 139, I'm thinking of right now, where characters are saying things that they really feel, and then they say at the end, yeah, Lord, teach me if I stepped over the boundary here. Well, they use different words, but effectively that is impressive. What Jonah is doing here is not impressive. I mean, people say things like, I hate the guts of my enemies, but Lord, teach me. That is impressive. This is not impressive, because this is Jonah playing Israel's role, and that was not impressive because God wasn't kidding in Genesis 12 to Abraham when Abraham, the sort of the founding father of Israel. God wasn't kidding. Jonah apparently is. So anyway, he's vomited out of the fish, and and God starts again. Go to the Ninevites. Look at the role reversal. God has to keep responding to Jonah's failures, and Jonah's failures are the narrative motif that drives everything here. And then he's supposed to say to the Ninevites that in 40 days, if they don't repent, that all kinds of shenanigans is going to fall upon them. There's an irony there too. Israel spent 40 years in the desert, in some ways, you could say symbolically, the Ninevites are in less trouble than Israel was at the time. There's a question of how far we take some of these ironies, but I'll, it's 40 is a highly symbolic number, and you see that even how Jesus emulates the wilderness time at the time of the Exodus with Moses, how he spends being tempted for 40 days with the fasting and everything, the devil and so on. You get it in Luke and Matthew especially. All right. All right, let's fast forward a bit. The king, the king of the Ninevites, now he doesn't come across as fabulous. I mean, he does make the animals, even the animals, this is grotesque. He does make them put on sackcloth and cry out to God, even them. But notice that the decision to repent and do the sackcloth and ashes thing was actually the people's. There's another irony. And then the king says, okay, I suppose, hey, let's do this. It was the people's idea. It was not the king's idea. And yet the king apparently knew the God of Israel better in this story than Jonah did, because whereas Jonah said, I don't know what God wants to do. God, what do you want to do? The king at least says, let's figure out what God wants to do. So we have an inverse hierarchy here, and Jonah is at the bottom of it, and the king is somewhere in the middle, and the Israelites, the Ninevites, the sailors are kind of at the top. They get it more than anyone. They're really, they're really in a good place. And you know, I've had students made up T-shirts for me. They had got American Apparel make up T-shirts, and they sold them amongst themselves. And I always use this phrase, minor characters. That's where it's at in the Bible. Like, it's not the 12, whether they voted in Matthias or not. Who cares? The dude never shows up anywhere anymore. And they fail so miserably throughout the Gospels, including Acts, which is part of a Gospel. So it's the minor characters that actually get the work done. In the New Testament, and we see it here in the Old Testament. The sailors are in many ways way more impressive than Jonah. That is my point. So Jonah sulks, and he says to God, this is why I fled in the first place. Like, God, you got this so wrong. You don't get it at all, do you? And now, Lord, take my life away. It's better for me to die. Says the guy who had every chance to die in the corner of a fish, but wrote poetry contradicting everything he had said before. It's bizarre. It's grotesque. It is satire. Jonah thinks he's the reasonable one. And you know, the thing is, when people think this is about Jonah, the person, as opposed to Israel, so it's not a parody, it's about Jonah, the person, when people claim that, they can only claim that because we're so individualistic. No one in antiquity would have not seen what Jonah really represents. In a tribal society, of course, he represented the people at large. So he goes now outside of the city. He builds a booth. He basically wants to be up there in the bleachers and watch what's going to unfold down there. He still thinks God's going to kill all these Ninevites, and he's going to have the seat to watch it. And then God grows the tree. You know that thing about the tree. And Jonah, so fickle. Israel again, so fickle. Now he's happy about the tree that suddenly, bam, there's a tree. How about that? That happened quickly. And then just as he's enjoying the tree for a bit of shade, the tree goes away again because God sent a worm and a huge fish and a tiny little worm. God uses all kinds of things to get Jonah / Israel interested in God's in this project humanity that God really wants Israel for. But in any case, so he goes from happy to angry again, so fickle. And God's reply is I'm sorry, not so much God's reply, but let me put it this way. The way, if you go to Genesis 12 and you look at that covenant that God made with Israel, we've known all along that Jonah is going in the wrong direction here. But we also have known all along that that's exactly what Israel did. That we had the 40 years, right? And we had all these cycles with the judges up and down and up and down, the same with the kings and so on. And it's interesting to me that God says he's not really worried about the Ninevites. You know what that means? That means he's really worried about Israel instead. I mean, God is very engaged in this. And if it's not the Ninevites he's worried about, then of course it's Israel. So who's the target of this particular comedic satire? It's not the Ninevites as per God in the story. It's not the strange prophet who experiences absolutely grotesque things. It's not a silly man who resists God because he knows better. Those are characters in the story. But ultimately, the referentiality, what it actually refers to, I mentioned SNL, Saturday Night Live, as an example. What that targets is outside of SNL, right? And that's how satire works. Apparently, it's Israel who performs terribly. I want to, before I close here, I want to go to the New Testament briefly and show you that this idea of an individual representing Israel symbolically is absolutely a thing in those circles, even in New Testament times. There's this chapter, Romans 7, fascinating chapter, and people, of course, individualize the heck out of it, where Paul says, I'm a wretched man. I want to do one thing, but I end up doing the other thing. And there was a time before the law, and then the law came and things got worse. Wait, there was never a time before the law in Paul's life. I mean, the guy was circumcised and everything. He was born into a situation of law. All his life was about that until he met the risen Jesus. No, Romans 7 is not about Paul. You can't even make sense of the text that way. You read that as Paul speaking on behalf of Israel, it explodes in the best possible way right before your eyes. And suddenly all of that makes sense. The time before the law, and then the law came and Israel got itself into more trouble and so on. So that's one example. He represents Israel. I'll give you one more, and this one is from Luke 1. It's Mary in the Magnificat, mother of Jesus. Blessed is the woman, that one. And she clearly represents Israel. Why do we think that in her psalm, the Psalm of Mary, I call it that, we call it Magnificat, whatever, in that, in there, she refers right back to Abraham and the prophets. And it's like a little history lesson of Israel, the Magnificat. It's not about her as a person. We are so individualist. And then we know what Roman Catholicism did with all that. No, you can't use Luke 1 for that. Well, you can, but it's a misuse. You just lost the text. So anyway, my point is we need to get over our individualisms, and we need to see that when Paul uses the first person, he's actually speaking on behalf of Israel. When Mary uses the first person, she's actually speaking on behalf of Israel. And when Jonah speaks, he's actually speaking on behalf of Israel. So what then does satire involve? Well, absurdity of characterization, grotesque events, wordplays. We need Hebrew for that. Stayed away from that for our purposes here. Fantastical storylines, distortions and exaggerations, ironies, big and small, ridicule. Jonah knows better than God. Sharp changes in direction. He's disobedient, then pious, then hypocritical, then warm and fuzzy under the tree, and then angry, and then suicidal, and the story ends. A clear target in real life has to be sought here if it's not about the person of the prophet. And that clear target, without a shadow of a doubt, Israel. Two final observations. My plea to other scholars, speaking as a scholar for a minute, my plea to them is stop treating inconsistencies in the text as problems to be solved. I'll just leave it at that. We're not doing a scholarly thing here per se. I'll just leave it at that. And one final comment here. Why does Jesus use this Jonah story in Luke 11 and in Mark 12? Well, he's in the middle of facing Israel at its worst, so much so that he calls them this evil generation. And then he says, you had the sign of Jonah and you didn't respond. And now you have my sign, and he refers to the resurrection, 3 days in the tomb. Are you going to respond then? Or are you so out of it that basically God has to do this project, humanity, without you? You trample on the weakest instead of looking after that. You don't care for the Gentiles. You disregarded the sign of Jonah. Are you going to disregard something greater than that now? I'm done. I'd like to hear from you. Over to you.
Question. I have not studied the Old Testament. I'm not a scholar of the Old Testament.
Okay.
But I have a question about the book of Jonah and the insights that you have about irony and interesting perspective on that. But that makes me wonder who wrote the book of Jonah then, because clearly somebody wrote that and put in those ironies. So now I'm more curious about where did the book of Jonah come from?
Questions about who wrote something empirically are exceedingly difficult for us. We basically, most of the time, do not know. There are texts that claim to have been written by a certain person, but even looking at the New Testament, the vast majority of the New Testament never claims even to have been written by this or that person. Like when we ascribe Matthew to Matthew and Mark to Mark and Luke to Luke and so on, none of those texts are actually claiming that. And these are later traditions that make those claims. Thankfully, we don't need them for interpretation. As far as the prophets are concerned, the 12 prophets, the minor prophets, we know what they're about. They claim to be about this prophet, that prophet, or another prophet. We know what people thought at the time this is about. But the actual empirical writing of these prophets, well, the vast majority of them, we really do not know, because they apparently focused more on the content side than, and then later they added labels and sometimes false names. Like you can read something called the, fourth Ezra. That's not in the Bible, but people attach famous names to documents later, but we have no way of getting back to who actually empirically wrote these things. But the good news is we don't really need it for interpretation.
No, but it sounds like there's purposeful irony there. So I'm wondering.
Oh yeah, somebody did that.
I think that I want to know. Okay, what was their axe to grind? Why? I mean, with this greater criticism of Israel, it's just really interesting to me. How were those ironies that you've discovered, that you've seen? Were they purposeful, or were they? Are you just finding out that they were just there?
Right. You're quite right. Somebody made sure that we would see this, but we don't need to know about the somebody. We need to see the this, if you see what I mean, right? So in the case, same with Samuel and Kings, there were probably different editions involved, and we have the later ones. There were some developments. Something was written early, and then someone else came along and had some other things, and they added to it, and so on. Ultimately, to do theology, to speak to notions of faith based on texts that are important to us, means to focus on the text, what's in the text. It's a little bit like, let me put it this way, if you watch something like, I don't know, Seinfeld or Friends or something on TV, you could ask about the studio in which that was recorded, and that's a reasonable question. But fortunately, to understand the episode, you don't need to know about the studio. That's kind of the situation we have here. But you're right. Somebody put this there purposefully. But if you're asking who was it, I don't know.
You talked about the oral tradition in those tribal societies. Did these stories come out of allegories that were told over the campfire over the decades and centuries that finally got actually codified and written down? So was this storytelling around the fire just to give examples of right living and so on?
Mostly stories were controlled, and this is true of humanity in general. Mostly they're controlled by those who run the show, in other words, who are institutional. Now, there are different forms of institutionality at the time, but it's usually those who are able to control how people retell stories. So in oral societies, you have to keep retelling stories. There's fascinating anthropological research on this, even in the former Yugoslavia, which that whole area, it's now many decades ago, but there was a very strong oral culture, and even in some Western societies today, there are those who still have the gift of telling and retelling stories in smaller settings and so on. But ultimately, in those days, back then, those were controlled by whoever the leaders were. Also, actually, by the community. That is, if you imagine that fireplace situation, or somebody tells a story that the others who were there, they already know the story, what would typically happen is if the storyteller that day in that community happens to get something wrong, the community will correct that person. Fascinating things like that. So we know how oral tradition works basically, but again, where does it originally come from? We do not know, but we know how things get transmitted. This, by the way, is why some writings in the Hebrew scriptures that in Christian circles we call the Old Testament, why some of those writings, you have alliterations there in that form, like in Hebrew, each sentence starts with the next letter of the Hebrew alphabet. That helps greatly with oral tradition. It's like a constant clue, a constant reminder of what comes next. And that's just a very simple example. There are many other examples like that. So my answer to you is we know a whole lot more once a story was in circulation about how they kept it going. We don't know how it started. Somebody sort of came up with it, but presumably it started by people talking daily about how their leaders were doing, how they're doing as a tribe or as a nation, and so on. People talk about these things, and somewhere in there it started, but we don't have details. But again, we don't need those in order to interpret well. My encouragement would be, yes, we can speculate about historical points of origin and so on, but what we really need is to interpret well.
A lot of the stories in the Genesis and stuff are probably parables, not necessarily true fact stories, but are parables.
I think so. And I've taught in different schools at numerous universities and also 2 seminaries, one more conservative and one more liberal. And I never changed what I told people depending on those contexts. But in the more conservative one, that would be Bethel, in the case of the Twin Cities, there were students who, when I would say things like what I told you today, who are responding with kind of fear and trepidation. And I'm not saying that's why you're asking about Genesis. Your question is a very good one, and my answer is yes. There's a real mix. There's historical claims, and then there are claims of the nature that we talked about today. But some people cannot have that. So I've had people, hundreds probably, tell me that this view of Jonah is unacceptable to them, not because of Jonah, but because of where does it end? What else are we going to find, and then those are not factual events. And you mentioned Genesis and so on. And my point to them, I'm not saying that's your concern, but my point to them is, don't start with worrying about that. I mean, ideally, never worry about that. What you should always worry about is how to interpret well, instead of asking the wrong questions and immediately ending up in a place where you lose the very thing you want to base some of your faith on.
Appreciate your presentation here. Thanks so much.
Yeah, it was good meeting you all.
So we'll
All right.
disconnect. Thank you, Thorsten.